Good evening. Thank you for joining us for Haunted North Carolina. My name is Tammy and this is Genevieve, and tonight we're going to be telling you North Carolina ghost stories. And remember, in every story, there's a grain of truth. Our first story takes place in the early 1700s, about 1710. There'd been a lot of war in Europe, especially in Germany. And there's a region over in Germany called Palatine, so the people who lived there were called Palatines. Now, there was a war going on, and a lot of them had gone to England, but there were so many, they all couldn't find work. So a group of them got on the ship and sailed to North Carolina and created New Bern. Well, a little bit later, there was another group coming over, the Palatines, and these Palatines were a little bit more wealthy. They had gold coins, they had silver candlesticks, gold-plated dishes, everything like that. Well, they didn't want to get robbed. They knew about pirates. This was the golden age of piracy. So they dressed in plain clothes and hid their gold and their silver in old, worn-out sacks so nobody would know, and they boarded the ship. Well, they got all the way to the North Carolina coast near Ocracoke Island. And it was late in the day when they spotted land, and they were just so excited. They all hurried up on deck, and they brought their sacks up with them and their clothes and everything. And I guess some of the sacks split open because the captain noticed he could see glints of gold and silver and things like that. He realized these people have money. And what these people didn't know is this captain used to be a pirate. Now he had then become a privateer, which basically meant you had a king's protection, you only were supposed to raid his enemies, and if you got captured, you didn't get hanged, you were more likely for the king to pay the ransom. It was a respectable form of piracy, if there is such a thing. But when he saw that gold and silver, he couldn't help himself. He reverted to his old ways. So he told them, it's late in the day, we can't land, we'll land first thing in the morning. So the people, they're very disappointed, but they take their sacks and everything and they go back downstairs and they go to sleep. Now, it was a new moon, which basically means there was no moon. So it was a very, very dark night. The captain called all his crew together and told them what was going on, that the passengers had money. And the crew decided, we'd like some of those gold and silver coins and candlesticks and gold-plated dishes for ourselves. And they didn't mind that it was dark. They knew that ship like the back of their hand. So they waited every night, waited till it was time for everybody to go to sleep. And if there were any Palatines still awake, I'm sure they quickly got taken care of. But the captain and his crew crept down below decks and killed every man, woman, and child. Now, every big ship had a ship called a longboat that they would use to take back and forth to shore. It was probably also their version of a lifeboat. And after they had killed everybody, they didn't throw the bodies overboard. They covered the ship in oil, pitch, anything they could think of that would burn. They lowered the treasure into the longboat. They set the ship on fire. It wasn't anchored down. They set it adrift, and they just got in the longboat and took off for shore. And as they looked back, they noticed the glow was getting a little bit brighter, but closer. They're like, oh, the ship's burning. A little bit brighter, a little bit closer. They looked behind them, and to their horror, the ship was on fire. The sails were burning, the mast was burning, the deck was on fire, the ship was turning black, but it wasn't disintegrating. It was still in one piece. And then to their horror, now remember, these sails are burning, and this is a wooden-driven ship. There's nobody on there with oars. And to their horror, the ship began to move towards them. And through the whole night, they had to dodge it because the ship kept moving towards them. And it shouldn't be able to do that. It should be burning. It should be sinking. The ship kept chasing them. They finally got to shore, and the sun rose the next morning. There was the ship sitting on the water. It was black, it was charred, but it was still in one piece. It had not burned, it had not sunk. And the next night it was there again. And the captain and his crew finally could not take it. They just took their treasure and went off running to get as far away from that ship as they could. And they never told anybody what they had done, but everybody knew something had happened. They might not have known who died or what ship it was, because to this day, if you stand at the mouth of the Neuse River on a certain day, on a certain night of a new moon in September, and you look off into the distance, you'll see something burning appear on the horizon. The ship appears, it disappears, comes back, moves back and forth, and then disappears for another year. The burning ship has returned, and so it will every year until the Palatimes are avenged.
So I first heard this story from my grandfather, who said that it had happened to a great aunt of mine. That was a while ago, and I've heard this story half a dozen ways since then, so either my great aunt had a lot more relatives than we realized, or my grandfather was maybe embroidering a bit. But the important thing to know is that this story is very definitely true. Great Aunt Lucy, who wasn't anyone's aunt then at all, but just a schoolgirl, was very excited for Halloween, or All Hallows Eve as they called it in those days. She was a shy girl, and she didn't have many friends, but that night her two cousins, who were big, jolly, brave-hearted girls, were going to come to spend the night. Well, her cousins arrived, and they spent the evening playing at taffy pulling and bobbing for apples and all kinds of parlor games. But after their parents had gone to bed, the three girls lay awake and whispered ghost stories to each other by the light of a single candle. "Look at Mary," laughed one of her cousins, pointing at Lucy's wide round eyes and the way she had her covers pulled up to her chin. "She's so scared." "I'm not scared," Lucy insisted, trying not to let her teeth chatter. "Are too," said her other cousin. "Why, you're scared of everything. You were even scared of that mean old man who used to live at the end of the road." Well, that was true. Lucy had been so scared of that mean old man that even though he died 2 weeks ago and been safely buried in the churchyard, she still crept past his house whenever she had to go out. But "I'm not scared," she insisted. "I'm not scared of anything." Now, there was just something about Lucy. Maybe it was her round cheeks or her soft brown hair or her wide eyes that made people want to tease her. Her cousin looked at her shivering there, and suddenly she got the most glorious idea. "Wait right there," she demanded, and she whisked out of the room. A minute later she was back, and she was carrying the big black iron toasting fork that usually hung by the fire in the parlor. "Prove it," she said, holding the toasting fork out to Lucy. "I dare you to sneak down to the graveyard and stab this fork into that old man's grave." Well, her sister knew a chance for fun when she saw it, and she instantly took up the idea. "Yes, you have to do it, Lucy, or you're a coward." In vain did poor Lucy insist that she was too scared, that she couldn't, that she would get in trouble, that she would surely die of fright. Her two cousins teased and bullied her until she finally reached out and took hold of that long iron fork. "Don't worry," said her cousins, maybe starting to feel a little guilty about how poor Lucy shivered and shook. "We'll come with you and wait at the gate of the graveyard, and we'll be there the whole time." The three girls threw shawls on over their long white nightgowns and crept slowly down the stairs and out of the house, quiet as mice, to keep from waking their parents. But it was half a mile to the graveyard, and to poor Lucy every step felt like her feet were weighted with lead. But no matter how slowly she walked, she still eventually found herself at the church. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, and she looked at her cousins as if to ask them to not make her do it. But they still pushed her through. "Go on," they said. "Do it, and you'll be the bravest of us all." Poor Lucy shuffled forward on unsteady feet. She could see the old man's grave, still so fresh that the earth hadn't had a chance to settle. When she was finally standing there at the foot of that mound, she looked back at the gate where her two cousins made shooing motions at her. "Go on, go on." Lucy didn't want to be a coward, so she screwed all of her courage up, and she screwed her eyes tight shut, and she raised that big, heavy iron fork, and she stabbed it into that old man's grave. No sooner had the fork left her hands than Lucy's courage gave out all at once and she turned to run. But she hadn't taken 2 steps when something grabbed her by the skirt, yanking her back towards that grave. She gave a scream. "He's got me! He's got me!" Over at the gate, those 2 big, brave cousins suddenly weren't so big and brave anymore. They heard Lucy scream and they saw her stumble and fall as if something was dragging her back into the grave. And those 2 big, brave girls turned and ran out of that graveyard as fast as their legs would carry them, all the way home and into the house and bed, where they huddled together with the covers pulled right up over their heads, too scared to even think about their poor cousin alone in that graveyard. In the morning, their parents woke to find one girl gone and the other 2 near out of their minds with fright. It took a while to get the story out of them, but when they finally did, everyone ran down to the churchyard. And there, on the old man's grave, huddled in a heap, was poor Lucy, dead of fright. And there also was that big black iron fork, stabbed right into the ground, and right through the hem of Lucy's gown, where she had pinned herself to the grave.
Our next story is about a haunted gold mine. Now, when you hear the word gold rush, everybody thinks of California in the 1840s. But North Carolina had a gold rush back in the 1790s. In about 1795, young Conrad Reed was playing in Meadow Creek in what is now Cabarrus County on his family's farm. Now, we don't know if he was fishing, just playing around in the water. It could have been summertime, but he was a boy playing in the creek. And he found this rather heavy, interesting little rock. It had like yellow and bronze and all these colors running through it, but it was a rock. And he, as boys will, he picked this big heavy rock up and hauled it home. Now, if me and you had hauled a heavy rock home like that when we were young, our mothers would have told us to leave it outside, but family used it as a doorstop. Well, a couple of years later, somebody who recognized a visitor, recognized something in that nasty old rock with the yellow and the bronze and everything running through it. He realized that rock was a nice big old hunk of gold. And so opened Reed Gold Mine, which is now a state historic site, but it was the first gold mine in that area. And, the Reeds opened their own mine, started mining on their own land. Other people joined in. And one of them was a man named McIntosh. Now, he was, for lack of a better word, a cheapskate. He didn't pay very well. He didn't really care about safety. And he was hard to work for. Matter of fact, he was so cheap, I could not find his first name. He has come down in history as Skinflint McIntosh, which basically tells you all you need to know. Now, he had found a mine with a rich vein of ore in it. The problem is it was straight down at the bottom of a 450-foot shaft. And you have to remember, these are the days when you have to go down a ladder. They didn't really have elevators. They did not have flashlights, so you're using lantern and candles and hoping they don't blow out. There's no hard helmets. There's no steel-toed boots. There's definitely not oxygen if something happens to you and there's a cave-in. So to prevent the cave-in, and remember, once you get to the bottom, we don't know how far out in each direction underground this mine went. First, you had to go down that deep, dark shaft. So every so often, once you got underground, mines will have timbers to support the roof and the walls to prevent a cave-in. And you want dry, hard wood. Something that's going to last, like a beam of oak or something. Well, Skinflint liked to go cheap, and he'd buy new wood that was still damp. They called it green wood, and it was full of moisture, and eventually it tended to crack and cause cave-in. So OSHA would hate him, to put it in the way modern people can understand it. Well, there were a lot of gold mines and a lot of gold miners coming in from places like England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. And they had done this in the past, and they really knew what they were doing, and they were very skilled, and everybody wanted these people, all the mine owners wanted these people to work for them. Well, one of the best miners in the area was Joe McGee. And Skinflint really wanted Joe to work for him. And Joe had heard about Skinflint. He knew he didn't pay well. He knew he liked to cut corners on safety. And he just wanted nothing to do with it. And Skinflint kept talking to him and offering more money. And Joe's attitude was, what good is money if you're not alive to spend it? And Skinflint's like, nothing's going to happen to you. This mine is safe. It's the richest vein of ore. I'm not going to risk that. And finally, Joe just looked at him one day and he said, if I go down there and something happens to me, will you pay my wife, Jenny, $1,000? Now, back then, you could buy a house, you could buy a farm, you'd be very well set up for life with $1,000. Skinflint said, I'll pay her $2,000. Joe said, okay. Now, remember, this is before life insurance policy, so this was a one-on-one deal with Joe and McIntosh. He said, I'll pay her $2,000. Joe said, okay. So Joe went to work for Skinflint, and he found a lot of gold, and Skinflint made a lot of money. Not that Joe got a whole lot of it. And one night, for a while, everything was fine. Joe would go to work, come home, have dinner, supper with Jenny, go to bed, get up, and do it again. One night, Joe didn't come home, so Jenny waited. Then Jenny waited another night. Then they went down. By this time, Joe's friends and the other miners are searching the mine, and they don't find him. They can't find evidence of a cave-in, so they don't know what's going on. And finally, Jenny went to Skinflint and said, look, Joe went down. He didn't come back up. Something's happened to Joe. Pay me my $2,000. You know, I'm a widow now. I've got to support myself. And Skinflint's like, Joe's run off. I don't owe you anything. Well, that night, Joe's best friend Sean gets a knock at the door. And he opens it. And it's late at night and it's dark. And he opens it, into this horror, there's this filmy, smoky looking, see-through apparition just hovering there. And remember, you've got no lights, you've got lanterns and candles, that's it. And to Sean's horror, it starts to speak in Joe's voice. And he said, I'm down in the mine, Sean. There was a cave-in. Take my friends and come down and get me out tonight. This is where you dig. I was probably at this point nodding and saying, yeah. Of course, if I'm looking at a ghost, I'll probably say that too. And then the ghost asked in Joe's voice, has Skinflint paid Jenny? Now, Sean didn't want to answer that question, but he said, no, he hasn't. He said you ran off. Ghost wasn't too happy to hear that, and he made a noise and just went back off. Well, I'm sorry. As much as I'd have been friends to Joe, if it'd been me, I'd have waited for daylight. You're telling me to go looking for a body, forget the ghost. You're telling me to go looking for a body down a 450-foot shaft in the dark at night with candles and lanterns and shovels and pickaxes, and I've just seen a ghost. No, I'm sorry. I'd have waited for sun. But Sean got his buddies, and they went down the mine, and they dug where the ghost told them. They found a cave-in. The timbers had given way. Skinflint had used green timbers, and they had just collapsed. And all that weight of the timber and the rock and the dirt had killed Joe. So they start digging, and right when they hit the body, there's a shout. I'm going to haunt this mine forever. Well, they took the body, but they didn't waste any time getting out of there. So the next morning they go to town and they take the body and they show it to Jenny, and then they go show it to Skinflint. And he still doesn't want to pay Jenny, but the body's right there in front of him. Jenny's right there in front of him. And Joe's friends are right there in front of him. So basically, Skinflint pays Jenny the money. He figures I'll clean up from the cave-in. You know, the money's still down there. The gold's still down there. I'll make it back. Well, the problem is, word got around about how Joe died. Problem is that miners also started telling stories about hearing noises in buildings around the mine when nobody's there, seeing doors and windows open when nobody's there. Some of them even claim they've seen objects move when nobody else is in the room. And the ones down in the mine claim they hear moaning and groaning. Something's down there. They're not sure what it is. And so people just started leaving. Joe's friends are leaving and quitting because of what happened to him. Some people are like, I'm not going down that shaft again. It's timber collapse, so they're leaving. And some of them are just scared out of their minds with things moving and groaning and creaking and doors and windows opening, and they're gone. And the problem is, once word got out, not only were they leaving, nobody would come work for McIntosh. And he's an older man. He can't go down there in that mine and get the gold out by himself. And it's sitting there and he can't get to it. And it just drove him insane. He died a broken, miserable, lost all of his money. He was just a pathetic old man when he died. But nobody still was going to go near that mine, even though Skinflint was gone. Well, nobody messing with that, with a ghost. So over time, people forgot all about the mine and where it was at. The story got passed, but not the location. So to this day, somewhere in that part of North Carolina, near Cabarrus County, the mine is still there, the gold is still there, and Joe is still there.
So this story, and the other story I'm going to tell you tonight, came out of the Uwaris. If you don't know what the Uwaris are, they're an old range of mountains. So old that folks are pretty sure they're the oldest mountains in all of North America, and they're right here in North Carolina. Now, when you have land that's that old, it's seen a lot of things happen, and maybe that's why we have so many legends and stories in that area, and why so many strange things still happen there to this day. So a while ago, maybe about the time of my grandparents, or maybe about the time of theirs, an old man lived in a shack deep in the woods with his 3 dogs, Rip, Nip, and Rattlebones. He was a poor man, and it was a simple life. His house was just one room that served his bedroom and kitchen and living room all at once, and the dogs slept underneath the creaky old boards of the porch. Well, one day the man went hunting to catch something for his supper. Here, 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 he called to his dogs, and they all set off into the woods. But after many hours of hunting, the sun began to set and the wind began to blow. And all we've caught is this one skinny rabbit, grumbled the man, and he went home where he boiled that rabbit and ate it and threw the bones to the dogs. It wasn't hardly enough supper for man or beast, and maybe that's why the man found himself lying awake in his bed as the moon rose wide and full. He lay there and listened to the wind howling around the cabin and blowing through the cracks between the logs, and then he heard the most curious noise. Scratch, scratch, scratch. And as he lay there and watched, a creature crept through one of those cracks. He'd never seen a creature like it. It was black as a shadow and hairy like a dog, but it had glowing yellow eyes and claws like a cat, and the biggest, fattest tail he'd ever seen. Well, the old man wasn't going to just lie there and let any old varmint sneak into his house. Quick as a wink, he snatched up a hatchet and cut that creature's tail clean off. The critter didn't give him a chance for a second blow. It slipped through the cracks and was gone. The old man might have thought he dreamed the whole thing, except there was that fine, fat tail that the creature had left behind. Now, maybe you or I haven't ever been as hungry as that old man, but you know what he did? He put his pot on the fire, and he skinned that tail, and he boiled it, and he ate it right up. Now, you sleep much better on a full stomach than an empty one, and that old man should have slept right on till morning. But somehow he hadn't been asleep very long when he woke up. Something was climbing his cabin. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Darn varmint, the man grumbled and thumped on the wall to scare it away. But after a minute, it began again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Well, the old man started to have a funny feeling about that scratching sound. He sat up in bed and called out, "Who's there?" The scratching stopped. For a little while, everything was quiet, and the old man began to relax. But then he heard a strange voice, eerie and slow. Taily-po, taily-po. All I want is my taily-po. scratching began again, and the old man started to shiver and shake, but then he remembered his dogs, and he called out loudly, "Here, Rip, here, Nip, here, Rattlebones." And the dogs woke up and piled out from under the porch, and with a growling and a howling, they chased that scratching thing away into the woods. Well, the old man thought that was the end of that. He slept through the night and woke the next day to the sun shining and the birds singing. He and the dogs roamed the woods all that day and came back to the house for supper and bed, and the man didn't think one more thing about that strange black creature. Until, in the dead of night, something woke him up. Scratch, scratch, scratch. "Who's there?" he called, not really wanting an answer. And from out of the night he heard, "Taily-po, Taily-po, I'm coming for my Taily-po." Well, the old man's shout was really more of a shriek. "Rip, Nip, Rattlebones!" And once again the dogs piled out from under the porch and chased that thing away into the woods. Well, the sun didn't seem so bright the next day, and the old man spent that day shoving river mud into the cracks between the logs, patching every hole that he could find. But towards evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, all the dogs' ears pricked up and they turned towards the woods. The old man tried to stop them, but with a howling and a growling they were off as if they were on something's trail, and all he could do was stand there and watch as they vanished into the woods, leaving him alone with the wind sighing around his shack. Well, it was a very shaky old man indeed who barred his door that night and got into bed. He tried to listen for the sound of his dogs coming back, but all he heard was the wind whistling around the cabin. And then, up on the roof, he heard scratch, scratch, scratch. The old man sat straight up and hollered, "Rip!" But there wasn't an answer. "Nip, Rattlebones!" But he didn't hear the growling of his hounds. No, what he heard was a soft, sighing, gleeful voice. "You know, and I know, I'm here to get my Taily-po." There was a scrabbling noise from the fireplace, like something climbing down the chimney. And then two long black arms crept their way into the room, followed by two glowing yellow eyes. The old man pushed right back against the headboard as that shadowy thing came closer and shrieked, "I haven't got your Taily-po!" But the strange, strange creature, which now loomed over his bed, nearly as big as his house, shouted, "Yes, you have!" Now, that was a long time ago, and all that's left of that old man's shack now is a tumbled stone chimney. But people who go to those woods still say that they hear strange things. Some folks say that it sounds like the howling of three big dogs chasing something away through the woods. But other folks swear that what they hear sighing on the wind is Taily-po, Taily-po, now I've got my Taily-po.
Our last story, or at least the last one I'm going to tell, is actually kind of a local one. It happened in Fremont, which is in Wayne County. Now, Fremont today is a quiet town. It's doing all right, but it's kind of a quiet, rural place. Well, you have to remember back in the late early 1900s, the railroad came through part of eastern North Carolina, and it made a lot of changes. And it came through Fremont. And there were a lot of traveling people going back and forth, and around that railroad, entertainment sprung up. And by entertainment, I mean bars, taverns. They even used to have festivals, basically street parties that not only involved music and dancing and singing, but let's say rolling the dice, cockfighting, things like that. Well, you'd have all the people in town come, and you'd have a lot of workmen come in from the outer lying farms, and they usually won the contest because, let's face it, country boys, people who work on a farm, are a little bit stronger, a little bit bigger than their cousins from town. Well, one of the people who used to, and we don't know if he worked on a farm or he was there in town, was a man named Bolton. And that's the only name we have for him. But what we do know is Bolton, from all accounts, was big. He was tall, he was strong, he had big, bulky arms, strong legs. But the biggest thing about Bolton was his head and his mouth. Because Bolton liked to drink. He liked his whiskey, but he didn't like to pay for it. So he would do a trick. He'd come up and say, if I do this, will you give me a drink? Basically, taking a dare. Well, Bolton's trick involved breaking things over his head or breaking things open with his head. He used to brag about his hard head. And I don't mean being stubborn, although he obviously was that too. He would come up and he'd break a bottle upside his head and somebody would give him a drink. Or he'd come up and say, if I knock myself over the head with this 2x4, will you give me a drink? They'd be looking at him like, man, you crazy. And then he'd do it, act like it didn't hurt, and they'd give him another drink. Well, with enough alcohol, I'm sure it didn't hurt, but next morning, I'm surprised he could move. But that was Bolton's, what he did. He would go around from tavern to bar, and go from place to place and get free whiskey. Well, he especially loved the festivals because then he could go from group to group, booth to booth, and all the other people would be drinking too. So they were more likely to come on, Bolton, and have a drink. Well, one day there was a festival and let's face it, everybody was getting lit, including Bolton, a little bit more than usual. And the drunker he got, the more daring he got, or maybe I should say the more hard-headed he got. Break a bottle upside his head, get him a drink. Break a 2x4 over his head and give him a drink. And his favorite trick to do was whiskey used to come in little barrels, kegs with a wooden lid on them. Bolton liked to pick the keg of whiskey up and break it open by knocking the lid in with his head. Now, by that time, I'm sure he got a lot of whiskey because the innkeeper's like, I can't sell this. Nobody's going to want to drink it after he's had his nasty face in it. Go on and take it. So he liked to bust things in with his head. And he started to brag about how hard his head was, that his head was harder than anything, harder than bottles. He could stand up to a 2x4. He could knock in the lid of a whiskey barrel. And then he said, my head, and then when he got really, really drunk, he said, my head's hard enough to stop a train. My head's harder than a train. And about time he said it, they heard the quaint train whistle blow in the distance. He looked up, got this look on his face, and took off running for the tracks. Now people were like, yeah, go on. And then they realized Bolton was serious, so they went running after him, and they found him standing in the middle of the tracks, holding his head out towards the train. Now that sobered up some of the people pretty quick, because they didn't want to see this. They realized what the outcome was going to be. So some of them tried to stop him, call him to come down, and some of them actually jumped on the tracks trying to pull him back, and they're pulling him off, and he's pulling away from him, breaking away from him, probably throwing elbows, and determined nothing's going to be harder than his head. He's going to stop that train. And the train's coming closer. It's coming down the track. Engineers blowing the horn, wondering, what is this fool doing? And the people trying to pull him off realized it's going to be him, or it's going to be him and us too. So they just jumped off the track, and probably some of them turned away or shut their eyes, because you know who won that contest. Between a man's head and a train, you know who won that contest. So and the engineer probably didn't believe the explanation when they told it to him. So when it was over, they gathered up what was left of him. And that tells you about what shape he was in. They gathered up what was left to him. They took him to the cemetery near the railroad tracks, and they buried him. They said a few words. They went back to their partying and turned the festival into Bolton's wake with the drinking and the gambling. They figured he'd appreciate that. But now, yes, Fremont is a quiet little town. But if you go down on certain nights, there near the railroad track is a cemetery. And if you watch closely, you'll see a green, glowing shape rise out of certain grave, move over to the railroad track. It'll hesitate, back and forth, up and down. Then after a while, it'll go back to the graveyard and sink down in that certain grave. And so, now, if I see that, I'm going to run. I'm not hanging around. But some people have got close enough to it. They've actually looked into that green glowing mist, and inside it, they see the shape of a large human skull. Now, if I was looking in it, that would be enough for me. If I didn't run when I first see it, I'd be running when I saw a floating skull. Sorry. But some people stick around because they say they've heard that skull speak, a voice come out of it. Is it a tale of warning not to brag and not to get drunk? Is it, oh, woe is me, where's the rest of me? No. The skull looks at them and asks them if they can spare him a shot of whiskey.
Oh, it must be over 100 years ago now. There was a peddler named Pete. They didn't have internet shopping in those days, and they barely even had catalogs. Most of the time, if you wanted something, you had to travel a day or more into town to buy it. So there were men called peddlers, men who would carry a big, heavy pack full of all kinds of little things that a folk might want to buy, and these peddlers would roam everywhere that there was a road, from farm to farm, selling as they went. Now, peddlers were hardy folk, and Pete was well used to sleeping rough. But this particular night was wild and cold, and as the sun set, the wind was whipping up fair to freeze his bones. So when Peddler Pete saw a farmhouse off in the distance, he didn't hesitate to go up and ask if maybe they had somewhere warm that he could spend the night. It was an old farmer and his wife who opened the door. They weren't the most friendly-looking couple, but sometimes grim faces hide kind hearts, so Pete swallowed his nerves and asked if they could spare him somewhere to bed down for the night. The couple stared back at him in silence for a while, and Pete got more and more nervous, but eventually the old woman said, "You can come in and have dinner and sleep in the boys' bed tonight." Well, things were looking up for Pete, or so he thought. He followed them into the house and sat down in their kitchen, where they ate a grim, cold meal. Pete tried talking a few times because he liked to pay his way in whatever gossip he'd picked up along the road, but they met his conversation with stony faces. They were eating in silence when Pete heard the door open and close, and then the sound of heavy footsteps. "Ah," said the farmer, first thing he'd said all evening, "that'll be the boy." Now, Pete was expecting what you might be expecting, but the person who entered the room was a man full grown, a head and a half taller than Pete, with arms like fence posts. "Boy," said the farmer, "you're going to need to give this peddler a bed tonight. Understand?" The boy looked at Pete, and Pete looked at the boy. "I understand," said the boy, and smiled. Now, it's a funny thing, but that smile, the first smile Pete had seen since he'd set foot on that farm, didn't make him feel more comfortable at all. In fact, he'd felt a right bit more comfortable before he saw that smile. Well, it was a relief to finally leave that table and lug his heavy cases up the staircase to the attic room. But no sooner had he entered the room than he heard a sudden thud behind him and then a click. He turned, quick as a wink, but it wasn't quick enough. The door was closed, and a tug on it proved his worst fear. He'd been locked in. That uncomfortable feeling he'd been having all evening suddenly became certain. This old couple meant to rob him, and he'd likely not live to see another dawn. Well, he pulled and pushed at the door for a while, and then he went across to the window, only to find that it had been boarded up and nailed shut. But when he pressed his eye to a gap in the board, he could see through into the farmyard below. And what do you think he saw? He saw that boy with a shovel that looked almost like a toy in his big hands, and he was digging. Now, there's a lot of kinds of holes that farmers dig, depending on if they're planting potatoes or pecans, but there was only one thing Pete knew of that was planted in a hole 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. As he stared at that hole being dug deeper and deeper, he began to hear a funny noise from below in the house, a sort of whit, whit, whit. That, Pete knew, was the sound of a knife being sharpened. Whit, whit, whit. Well, Pete staggered over to the bed and sunk down on it with his head in his hands. But no sooner had he sat down on that bed than he heard another, even stranger noise. Whoa! It sounded like it came from right under his feet. No, right under his bed. Poor Pete shot off that bed so fast he nearly got splinters from the floor. Then he stood there shaking and listened. Oh. Now, Pete wasn't a brave man, but right then he did the bravest thing he'd done all night. He bent over and he lifted the edge of the quilt and he looked under that bed. And underneath it, looking back at him, was a dead man. Well, Pete was about done in. All he could do was stare in horror as a white fat fog gathered about that dead man and slowly rose, writhing and twisting until it was as tall as a man, going, "Oh!" "Sorry about that. Got carried away there. It's an urge you get once you're a ghost, you know." Now, strange as this might seem to you, but that ghostly apparition was so much friendlier looking than anyone else Pete had seen that night that he swallowed his fright and asked, were you a peddler too?" The ghost nodded sadly. "I was. Not anymore, I suppose. I stopped here a few nights ago, and in the middle of the night the farmer and his wife came in and, well, as you see. And now they're planning to do the same to you." Pete's teeth began to chatter again. "I know! What am I to do?" "Don't worry," said the ghost. "I think that between the two of us, we can outwit that farmer and his wife and get you free." For the first time since he'd heard that door locked behind him, Pete felt a glimmer of hope. "What do I need to do?" "Well," said the ghost, "I need you to get my body into the bed. It's not like I can do it after all." Well, Pete enjoyed that about as much as you might expect, but with all of his strength he managed to wrestle that stiff, dead body up onto the bed, and under the ghost's instructions he pulled the covers up to its chin so that it almost looked like Pete was sleeping there. But as Pete looked at that cold face in the candlelight, he started to shiver all over again. "But you don't look a thing like me," he protested. "They'll see in an instant that they've been tricked." "Don't you worry about that," said the ghost. "I've picked up a trick or two in the couple of days I've been haunting this place, and I'll take care of that. Now, quick!" And as he listened, Pete realized that had stopped, and then he heard a footfall on the bottom step. "Stand by the door and slip out once they've come in," said the ghost. "Run as fast as you can, and whatever you do, don't look back." Pete did what the ghost said and flattened himself against the wall. Those footsteps came closer and closer, and then came the click of a key being turned in the lock, and the slow creak as the door was pushed open. From where he huddled in the door's shadow, Pete watched the man and his wife as they crept past him towards the bed, a knife held high in the old man's hand. As soon as they were past, Pete slid around the door as quick as he could. But before he took that last step out of the room, he couldn't resist. He took one last look back at the bed and the still figure lying there. Now, this whole time, that big, strong boy had been out in the yard digging that hole. But now he thought he saw something flash past him, almost faster than he could see. Well, that flash was poor Peddler Pete, running like he'd never run before in his life, and it would be miles and miles before he ever slowed down. Pete was scared of the farmer and his wife, and he was scared of that big, strong man, and he was scared of the dead man and that dead man's ghost. But more than anything else, what scared him so badly was what he'd seen when he looked back at that bed. Because the body that had been lying in that bed, stiff and cold, had been wearing Pete's face. They say that somewhere in the Uwharrie Hills you can still find a hole 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. But how deep it is, that's the mystery. Because no matter how they try to fill that hole in, it always sinks as if it will never be full. It's a grave that was dug for two, yet it buried only one.